A man chooses, a slave obeys.
Welcome to the Ethics in Video Games podcast, where we explore issues at the intersection of ethics and video games.
What follows is a series of graphic, interactive scenes that we can't show you.
All right, so welcome to our very first Video Game Ethics and News Updates podcast. So the idea here essentially is, in this podcast, normally we try to go deep into ethical issues in and about video games, but the video game world is ever happening, right? And there's always new things that we see that, can relate to an earlier episode that we've already done that we really wish we could go back to and talk about. Sometimes there's things that we know we won't be able to do a full episode about, but wouldn't it be great if we could just have a little bit of conversation on it? So we decided to make these kinds of episodes every so often, maybe every month or two, to kind of catch up in this way. Okay, so in episode 4, right, to remind you listeners, and episode 4 is great. If you haven't heard it, go listen to it. We talked about Steam censorship policy, and Steam until 2018 had a pretty conventional censorship policy that, it banned hate speech and pornography, exploitation of children, offensive content intended to shock or disgust viewers, among other things. And, we talked about how that led to a bunch of problems, like what is disgusting, right? What is exactly hate speech or exploitation? And Valve essentially decided in 2018 to change the policy to anything goes unless it's trolling or illegal, right? And supposedly they had a big discussion about it. And, we talked about that and the challenges of that. But then they kind of backtracked, right? So in 2019, there was the game Rape Day. And the Rape Day is a visual novel where it's very much the intention is to rape, right?
Right. And it's, we should make clear that Rape Day is cartoon.
Well, that's rape. It's cartoon. Yeah, and that's important. As is Rape Play, right, which is a raping hentai game, right? Right. So we're talking about cartoon. We're not talking about physical people, and that's going to matter. And Andy and I at that point we ended up agreeing, which I found really surprising at the time, that maybe the best that someplace like Steam can do is to not have any strict rules, but instead have a set of general guidelines, right, that they would give to developers that would and players, because I think players deserve, an understanding of what they're getting access to or not, that would express what they take into consideration when thinking about whether or not to allow a game into their store, right?
Right.
And, we think this is maybe the best you can do because, God, there's so many things that just seem to be a case-by-case basis. But you can't just say to people, it's on a case-by-case basis, because if I'm developing a game, can I get my game into your near monopoly, platform?
Right.
Well, we'll let you know after you spend all your money developing the game, right? On a case-by-case basis is a terrible kind of, way to treat developers. Right.
Although I would say that this is basically the way it's done. Even games like when I was developing games for Sony PlayStation and for Sega Dreamcast before that, you would submit ideas to your publishers ahead of time, and they would okay it, and you would submit the script, and they would have to okay it. There would be these. It wouldn't all happen at the end,
right? But
with Steam as a store,
it's all at the
basically end. It all comes at the end because they're not publishing it. They're just the storefront for you. You're self-publishing it. You're making this game all by yourself,
right? And they lose nothing by not publishing. I'm assuming they lose a share, right? But
they lose opportunity, right? It's opportunity lost,
right? But the loss to you as developers is enormous,
right? But the point is that it was always sort of just up to the whim and the feelings of your publisher at any given moment. And those moments could change. I remember when I was working at Sony, my then boss proposed a game. We were working with this company in Japan, this developer in Japan, who had made really, really good boxing games. They were they're known for their really, really excellent boxing games. And we were trying to come up with some sort of twist on the boxing games that they could make, and it would be kind of cool. And they came up with this great idea, which was, this would have been like in 2003 or 4. World leaders, like bobbleheaded world leaders, like cartoony, right. It was meant to look like a political cartoon.
Okay.
But they're boxing.
Right.
So they're fighting, and they were also giants. They were kaiju size. So the rings that they were fighting in were like if it was Washington D.C., it would be a tiny Washington D.C. that they were stomping around in.
Right. These are Godzilla level.
Like Godzilla, yeah. but they were boxing, and they were bobblehead, right. And they were and it was all very funny, but it was going to include the world leaders of the time, and Sony was interested, and then they got into PR heat because in some other wing of the giant organization, had tried to copyright shock and awe.
What? Really?
The term. They tried to trademark the term shock and awe.
So this had nothing to do with the game itself, just the shock and awe term.
The shock and awe term, they had tried to trademark it. The press had found out. There was a shitstorm of PR against them for trying to trademark a commonly used term. Okay. And that ripple of that canceled our boxing game.
Okay. That's interesting. By the way, in my class, on day one, when I give them a bunch of potentially controversial games, one of the game is a sniper game. Where you go on missions to randomly selected world leaders to shoot randomly selected world leaders. But these world leaders are current world leaders, and they're updated. The game is updated whenever there's a new world leader. But it's cartoonish. Right. And, I asked the students, do they think, what do they think about the morality of a game like this? Right. And at least, in contemporary times, my students have like zero problem, right, with a game like this, right? Even if
presentation is everything. Presentation is everything.
Though it's interesting how that goes if you're, making it realistic looking and setting realistic sniper missions on them and stuff like that.
Right.
But
yeah.
Okay, so to go back to Super Seducer, right?
Yes.
Okay, so we were back to this because Steam rejected this other game, and the game is Super Seducer, and Super Seducer 3 is an interesting game. The whole series is essentially, these are all pickup artist games, right? Where the game says you learn powerful skills for attracting beautiful women and possibly other kinds of women, I'm assuming.
It's barely a game. It feels, it is a game, technically.
It's got enough game elements, I think, to be a game.
It's got enough game elements. You can lose.
Right, but essentially it's a visual story with videos where you get options of how you're supposed to respond, and
we should say they're live action videos.
Live action videos, and
live action videos. The game designer is the star, and
he is the super seducer that can help you be a super seducer. Right. So, in this game, essentially, there's videos of you out as you're in different chapters meeting these women, and you're trying to seduce them. I remember with the first one, I read a review of the first one, and it was like during the Me Too era. And the title of the article was literally Super Seducers, the last game we need in the Me Too era. And it was complaining about how the game gave you advice essentially about things like the woman says, well, I have a boyfriend, and how to essentially make her think that her boyfriend is controlling her. And she really needs to be free and independent. Right. Mm-hmm. And essentially how to not take no for an answer. Right. Mm-hmm. So people complained then about Super Seducer, and the content of it, right, that might be objectionable, might be the kind of advice maybe that is being given. And with Super Seducer 1, essentially after every choice that you make, so there's the scene and you make a choice, and then the Super Seducer guy comes and he's sitting on a bed with two women, both in lingerie. and both not looking at him, looking away, and looking intentionally bored. And it's all and in every move, in every video, that's how it looks. And it's obviously very intentional, and it's supposed to be funny, I think. But
it's hard to tell, because if you look through like fashion magazines,
you see that all the time. Right?
You see it all the time. It's these beautiful women lounging around looking bored.
Right. So that's kind of the idea, right? So that's the first one, and Steam had no problem with that one, right? The third one that recently came out, the only thing I can see that's really different is, instead of that scene I just described to you in a bed, what you have is you have a big white room full of like a whole bunch of women in white lingerie.
There's like a dozen women lounging around in different places, playing chess, doing other. it's like what are these women doing? And they're it's just this crazy, like it looks like a perfume commercial.
Yeah, kind of like except that in some scenes the girls are supposed to be like making out with each other. Though I'm assuming this doesn't go beyond like, kissing, right? Some girls are just checking their phones. I mean, it's
right.
So there is there's a censored version of this and an uncensored version of this. And, we both saw the censored. I'm assuming you can't see this.
I saw a video of the censored version.
Yeah, I'm assuming we can't see the uncensored version. And in the censored version, you can't see anything. I mean, it's so hard to see. You barely see women in lingerie. Right.
Right.
But Steam said, and apparently there's a big back and forth between Steam and the developer.
Yeah, supposedly he made the censored version so that Steam would approve it.
Right. And and their reasoning for this was that they said they don't accept anything that has sexually explicit images of real people. Right. So that part was really interesting. So first of all, that's a first, right? No one has ever heard that one. That seems like a new rule, right? I'm assuming that this rule came because, okay, so as we talked about last time when they changed their policy, now you have all these hentai games, right? That want to be. Because now pornography is allowed, so all these hentai games want to be on Steam, and Steam says, cool, you're good. And now there's tons of hentai games on Steam from what I understand. Right?
Okay.
At the same time, there's also, so that seemed cool, and maybe this idea of, and we talked about, does this mean that Steam is going to allow pornography? Or what about if they want to keep it to games, right? Porn games, right? And maybe this rule is a rule that Steam came up with in order to say, look, we don't want to have porn games. Right. Maybe. It's still the first that I've ever heard of it, and it's still very different than their policy. And it seems that minimally their policy would now be, you can do anything as long as it's not illegal or trollish or involve sexual explicit images of real people. And we're back to the question of, okay, what is sexually explicit here? And why does this, because meanwhile we had Rape Day that we talked about, right? And Rape Day, right, essentially was banned by Steam, though Steam said that Rape Day was straight up trolling, that it was specifically trolling the Me Too movement. And that was the only reason for its existence, which is why they took it off. But they also took off this game, this Japanese hentai game, or it's a visual novel kind of series called Taimenin Asagi. And it had like these 4 episodes taken down because they had torture and rape scenes. Now you're saying that
their written rules do not match their actual actions, right?
Right.
And so if you're a developer making a game that is of dubious ethical interest, what are your options? You can go like this guy's done and just publish it yourself on his website.
But he's barely going to sell anything there.
Sure, right? But if there's a market for it, they'll find it. Or another thing I thought of is like, well, this is just a great opportunity for some place to become another market for that kind of game.
Which is interesting, you know, if there is an opportunity here for a marketplace for, you know, because I'm assuming porn games you could get at porn websites, you know, but there's so few games here that we're talking about at this point. You know, rape
that we know of.
That we know of. Yeah, yeah, that's true. I mean,
there might be pornography is a huge market. I'm assuming that the overlap, the Venn diagram of pornography and gaming is probably quite large.
Right. And it's interesting when I think about hentai games that have things like rape, I'm assuming that there's tons of those. You know, involving tentacles and, you know, things like that, right?
Yeah.
You know, I can understand. Of course, as we said last time, right? Steam has every right to do this. There's no question about whether they have a right to do this.
Correct.
But they also have responsibility to, again, I think, be clear to developers about what they can do or not,
and to their patrons for what kinds of games they're going to find on there.
Right.
I think that's another responsibility that needs to be talked about.
So if I go up there and suddenly I find, you know, a game that has rape, right? And this is something I'm very concerned about, right? You know, they have the responsibility to kind of let me know ahead of time if this is that kind of marketplace.
Right. As a father, what's going to allow you to let your kid run free on Steam? Or you know, like how old?
Oh man,
knowing what Steam is going to do right now,
I don't.
How old is your kid going to be before you allow him to go on Steam and pick out any game he wants?
That's a really good question. You know, probably the age where he uses his own money and not mine. Right? I don't know. We'll see how that works, and we'll see what Steam is like. Then, I mean, yeah, that's a really interesting question, and it's also kind of interesting of. Okay, what is it about this idea of, I mean, there's so much pornographic anime on Steam now, so much hentai. There's even a game where you could have sex with a sheep called Sheep Love, right? What is the big deal about sexually explicit images of real people? These are just people in lingerie, right? This is not sex, right? This is not anything kind of close to sex. Even the censored version, right?
Here's what I suspect it's about. My suspicion is that it's about consent. That Steam does not have a way of knowing whether these women were consenting, or even if they're adults.
Right. I'm assuming you're filming something. You have consent. I'm assuming there's ways to kind of verify this.
But maybe there's not. I don't make pornography. I don't know what the the rules are. But I can imagine that if it's live action, there's going to be a question about whether or not the people involved were fully consenting. Or even fully adult.
Okay, now notice, right? If this is the rationale, hey Steam, let us know, right? I mean, right? Why not just explain if this is the rationale, right? You know, it's mind you, lots of platforms seem to, you know, be able to deal with this kind of situation. It doesn't seem like an impossible situation to deal with. And
no, and I suspect there are ways of dealing with it, but they might be expensive, and they might be ways that Steam just doesn't want to deal with.
Great, and I think that's you know, I think that seems worth talking about. It's interesting, right? So it's not just people, because when we're talking about the consent of all the people involved in the acting, right? In that case, well, the documentary footage and interviews of 6 Days of Fallujah, right? I'm going to go in there, but of course, it's not just that; it's the sex part, you know. And and anyway, it's interesting because I don't know what the space, you know, if I want to do, you know, a game for Game of Thrones. Right, that's a kind of realistic game of Game of Thrones, which has lots of sexually explicit. And mind you, it can be a Game of Thrones light. They're not actually having sex the way they do in Game of Thrones, right? I am still very, very dissatisfied with what's going on here. Yeah. But our suggestion still holds, right? That this could be solved simply by, sorry, when I say solved, I don't necessarily mean solved. I mean, their decisions could be respectable ones if they provide guidance for them and explanations for them ahead of time. And I think not just ahead of time, but I think, developers deserve an explanation specifically, even if they say this is our final, there's no, going back on this. This is just our final explanation to you. We're not going to revisit it. Okay.
Right.
Let's go to our last one. Our last one is super, super interesting.
Yep, absolutely. So, and this one, this is so new, I don't actually have anything written for it. But basically, Intel put out this video. This whole hour or so of Intel's talk is specifically about gaming computers. They're making and reaching into the gaming market, trying to make computers and chips and computational things for gamers. And this one is specifically, and it's a feature called Bleep, made by a company called Spirit AI. And what it does is it gives you a bunch of sliders to control. It listens to the audio coming in. It uses AI to pick out the kinds of audio and you have these sliders that will say, I will allow this much of these different kinds of speech through so that I can hear it. It allows me as the consumer to decide how much of and they had a list that sort of scrolled by behind him. Things you can slide up and down. Ableism and body shaming, 1 to 100%. Aggression, whatever that means, 1 to 100%. LGBTQ plus hate, 0 to 100%. Misogyny, name calling. The N word, weirdly enough, was not a slider. It was just a toggle, on or off. Racism and xenophobia, slider.
So when you say slider, the way I thought it meant was that you had, let's say, 4 settings of none, some, mostly, or whatever it's going to mean.
The dashboard they're showing just showed a slider.
Right. So you can't exactly tell, what exactly these things are. But I mean, the idea sounds amazing, right? So, you're playing, assuming, let's say, some Counter-Strike or something. Right. And instead of hearing, racist,
the normal litany of toxic, horrible language coming through,
right?
You just hear a bunch of bleeps, or maybe it just turns it off, so it's just blessed silence. I don't know.
And this is what's so interesting about this, just as an idea, right? And you could potentially add lots of other. It's can I add other things to this AI thing, like any political talk? I don't want political talk in my game, right? Anything else that might. It's such an interesting idea.
Yeah, it's super interesting. But so I should say at this point that it is not too far off from an idea that I had for a client of mine who was developing a sort of a social element, a chat and section for a game platform that they were working on. And in my idea, you would have settings for the kinds of similar, not exactly the same sort of settings, but you would have settings for what you wanted. But what's different about mine is that it would also allow you to define what those things meant.
Wow. So wait, is this, because you said chat, right?
Yeah, chat or vocal chat.
Right. So
it could be voice chat.
Right. So the first thing I was thinking about is something like a consent system, like we just talked about with the tabletop game.
Right. But in a consent system with a tabletop game, everybody's there at the beginning.
Right.
But in a social networking thing, you get people joining and dropping off and joining and dropping off all the time. So you have something where I want to be able to control what comes to my ears,
right,
or comes to my screen.
Right.
I don't necessarily, and this company was very explicit about them not wanting to be editors. They didn't want to put editorial control on what their players were doing.
So is the idea then that you're saying here's the kind of stuff I want, and you're saying, and by racist I mean these particular words, and the AI, let's say, deletes, bleeps, does whatever to those specific words?
Correct. But even more so, once that the AI has started associating the words that I don't like from other players, I'll just stop seeing those other players altogether. And I think that's the part where I think that the Intel people are missing is that I should be able to use this data, because they're basically going to collect this data, right? They're going to collect the data from all their players in terms of what the appropriate settings are,
right? And
they're also going to collect the data from all the voices that come through about how many times these things get triggered.
Wow, the possibilities here are just fascinating, right?
Yeah, so they're staggering. So it's super interesting.
So if you take that idea, right, that means that the AI can figure out which players are likely to do things that I don't want them to do and keep those out of my game, so it matches me with different players.
If they were smart, that's what they would do. But it doesn't sound like what they're pitching.
My first thing, though, I'm thinking about is, does this mean if I'm a white supremacist, I'm going to end up with a group of white supremacists in my game?
Yeah. You're gonna get secluded off in your little white supremacist ghetto, and that'll be fine for everybody else.
This, though, it's interesting, right? Because this is part of the concern that I have with this, right? Is that we're already in such bubbles with the people who agree or disagree with our worldview. It's interesting if this means that we're going to play too with people just from our bubbles. Right. And it's interesting, right? In things like matching people up for a game of Counter-Strike, I don't know if that matters in any way.
It shouldn't, but it does, because these people can't keep their mouths shut.
Right. But there's also, I mean, people make real friends from games, right? So games where really you have the ability to have social interactions.
But you're not going to make a real friend with a white supremacist.
Right. But if you're putting the white supremacists together, now you're connecting them together.
Right. But we'll know who they are.
Well, Intel will. Right, so it's interesting, right? Yeah, it's interesting what that.
There's privacy issues, right? There's all kinds of crazy issues with this.
Right. So this meal, and FBI wants to know, right? Hey, Intel, can you give me all the people that are cool with hearing white supremacist stuff, right?
Right.
Yeah, the whole thing is just really, really something. Right, I was looking at the article. I think it was the article that you sent me, right, by Galt from Vice. And it's interesting with his criticism, because my first thing, I told my wife about this, and she was like, "Well, what could be bad about that?" And of course, he's critical of this. Right. So, which is so it's interesting what his criticism are. So, right. He says he thinks it's a way of admitting defeat. If we can't stop players from being incredibly racist in chat, we could just filter out what they say and pretend they don't exist. But I thought that was like really, really unfair. It's not like
it seems very naive to me. Like he doesn't realize that we're already in our future dystopia, in the sense that online chat is horrible. That people are killing each other.
His future dystopia is it's the tech dystopia, right? The dystopia where technology takes over and divides us, and that these divisions themselves are covering over the real problems, right?
Right.
And essentially says, look, instead of dealing with racism, we're just going to create a system that allows us to not hear what we want. And I get the idea there, but Intel specifically said, look, we don't think this is going to solve the problem, but we think this will help.
Correct. That's right. Yeah. And they were very clear. They said it multiple times within those 4 minutes that this is not the whole problem. This is not solving the whole problem. This is only mitigating, an aspect of this for gamers.
Yes. Yeah, it's that seems to me to be, at least on the face of it, not particularly controversial, right?
I think it's positive, honestly.
Then you have this other kind of issue, right? Of, well, you can always say to someone, if you don't like what I'm saying, just, mute me, right? Though, it's interesting, right? Instead of muting someone, you're just going to mute their racist words or whatever racist or sexist stuff is going to be.
Yeah.
That seems to be an advantage to muting, to muting someone, you still can have a conversation with them, or
Right.
you can still play with them.
Yeah, I think it's a benefit. I think it's ultimately this could be used for, I mean, like anything, it could be used for good or ill, but I think what they're trying to do is quite noble, and probably the right way to go. It's not clear to me that I mock the sliders, but I think the sliders are kind of mockable. The idea that I could have 25% racism.
So what does that mean to you? Like,
well, that's what's so mockable is I can't understand what it means.
So here's one possibility, right? They're literally going to, quantify. First of all, I mean, you and I have talked about this in terms of, the students that I have that sometimes want to make games about racism. And how hard it is to make a game about racism, because racism is just so complicated, and there's so much questions about what is racist. I mean, and then think about sexism, and so many questions about what is sexist. So your idea of, let's say, letting people define that, is kind of one way to do it, and I'm assuming you can define the specific phrases or specific words, right?
More specifically, they would just in my case, I was actually dealing with typed chat and not voice chat.
Okay.
But it would work the same way in the sense that I could highlight a section of text chat and say, I don't want to see this again.
Which is interesting, because every time something is missing, I'm assuming you're going to know what's missing.
Yeah, possibly.
Right.
But, but more importantly, what it does is it says to the system, the guy who wrote this is somebody I probably don't want to see again.
Right. Which is interesting. Right.
Right. Which is the value of it. Because it defines somebody and the crime at the same moment,
or the offense.
The offense, the offense,
crime, right?
The crime to me, the offense to me,
okay,
right? And so I'm saying to the AI, this is the kind of thing I don't like to see, and this is the guy who says the kind of thing that I don't want to see.
Yeah, again, that's interesting, to be the guy, right? Yeah, that part worries me. I don't know what to think about that part. That part worries me a little bit, right?
I'll tell you this. I showed my design to a friend of mine who is an activist. She's a Black trans woman activist, and she says this is terrible. So she didn't like my plan either.
Okay.
As somebody who's often at the brunt of these of this toxicity. She didn't like my plan either. It put all of the, as she said, it put all of the onus on her to call out these things.
Oh, interesting. So since this is a user end product, right? It might make it so that companies feel like they have no responsibility to monitor or do anything about any kind of hate speech or anything else, because users already are empowered.
Right. They plug this thing in, and now they don't have any responsibility for taking editorial control over the stuff that's going on over their game.
What do you think about that?
Well, I think it's it's an incredibly valid point. And more importantly, I think her point, which is we shouldn't be asking these people to do the work. The people who are going to be who are targeted by hate speech should not be doing the work of building walls around themselves to protect themselves from hate speech.
Yeah, but I mean, it's not a whole lot of work. It's no one's making you do anything, right? You are essentially giving the option of filtering speech.
Right.
I mean, you're your own censor,
I take your
right?
point.
I mean,
but you have to see her point. It's like it's one more thing we're asking them to do to protect themselves from us.
Right. I mean, I see her point, right? Of course, us is, neither you or me, nor, it's interesting whether, again, you think of the game company's responsibility here. And that's a very interesting point about what is the game company's responsibility if chat filtering, things like this are available. Because
and in my opinion, it's their full responsibility.
So what does that mean?
That means, like, as a game designer, my responsibility is the experience that you're having playing my game.
Okay.
And when other people are making that experience bad for you, it is my responsibility to protect you from that bad experience that other players are causing.
So why not let's say there's this AI. Why not use the AI differently? Instead of using it this way, if the AI can identify all this stuff, just have the AI identify who says what automatically, flag those people, and do whatever it is that the company would do with those people. Which is interesting. What that would be: put them on their own server. Put them on your own server. Wait a minute, a server full of this is one of those great situations where, as technology advances, we need to think about it seriously and not jump to any quick conclusions or either way.
Yeah, it's super interesting. This is the kind of thing that we're going to see a lot more of as these AIs get better and better at doing these things. We're going to see them do this a lot more, and some of them are not going to be nearly as nobly intended as this is.
I wonder. So, are there some dark places where you see an AI like this potentially going?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it doesn't take long to go, all right, well, they've got AIs that can figure out what can pull hate speech from non-hate speech. Then they have AI. That AI can pull whatever kind of speech.
Oh man!
Whether it's to do something sort of neutral, like tell Google what kind of advertising to feed me,
right?
Which I feel is kind of neutral. To
AI's filter. Wow, AI's filter can be incredible for marketing. Right. Yeah. Wow. That's a whole new revenue for Intel.
And we're talking to our Alexas, and we're talking to our Siris.
Right. So any game that has this, and you're talking about hundreds of millions of players, right? Suddenly you gather all the data. You're doing the filtering, but you're catching everything else that they're mentioning in their conversations. Though again, given how much Google and Amazon already know about me, right? When we talked about that big data issue in episode 2, right, about monetization, you said, look, I already assume they know everything. So maybe that might not bother you already. But it is interesting what other nefarious, because big data can be scary.
Yeah.
All right. Whoa. Should we end it on this?
That was it.
Point?
I think so. Good podcast. GP.
All right. Play nice. You can subscribe and listen to all of our episodes wherever you listen to podcasts.